Hello. Welcome to Forums. We're going to start. Hopefully more people come in and find the place. Good job for you for finding it this week. So Forums, event by the Christian Union, dealing with issues with faith and work and how we kind of live as Christians in the world, especially this week as Pat brings us a Christian response to homelessness. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Great. Cool, so we've got this beautiful hammer drill in the back, so we're just going to get stuck into it. I wonder if I can ask a couple of questions, just whack your hand up. First question, who here knows someone who is homeless or lives in a boarding house or crisis accommodation? Good. I just want to kind of... Oh, you didn't, Rob? Good. So, what are your major blockers to helping someone who you walk past on the street? So we all walk past a whole bunch of people every day. What are our major blockers? Just call them out. Sorry? You're on the move? Yeah, no time? What else?
I think they're just going to, if you give them money, they're going to waste it. Like there's people who spend it on things which aren't affordable.
Yep. Do you want to elaborate on those things?
So it could be alcohol or drugs.
Yep.
Or there's, I don't know a lot of details, but I've heard there's, some strange ways that people are kind of in where it actually doesn't end up helping them.
Yeah. Yep, for sure. Any else?
Well, like that, if you don't feel good enough to help them in a real meaningful way. It's like, you don't want to give the money to really help them, but you don't feel you have to kind of give to them.
Yeah.
You can really help them.
Yeah, absolutely. Any others?
Social convention.
Yeah.
People don't stop generally.
Yep.
People don't.
I mean, for me, one of the big ones is like, where do I even start? Like, you know, it's this person sitting there and they've got like a dog and a hat, and I'm like, I don't even know what the first thing you need is. And so I guess what we're talking today about is the Christian response to it. How do we actually walk past people in a Christian way? And my experience, I'll talk about a bit, it actually isn't with this a lot, but it's with people who've been in this situation. So I'll just get started. I'm going to share a story about two guys. Because it's being recorded, I'm going to change their name. I'm going to call them Bob and Jeff. So Bob, I've known for 6 years. He's a great guy. He grew up in a horrendous home, and I use the word home so lightly because often home wasn't there. He had abusive parents, both his mother and his father, physically and sexually. They kind of moved around a lot. There wasn't really a stable home base. His mum drank a fair bit while she was pregnant, so he's got some kind of level of fetal alcohol syndrome existent. And then, so he left home at 13. As soon as he really could, he kind of ran away, and he actually lived in the bush with a bunch of other homeless kids, and they're kind of a bit of a hippie commune. And what they did a lot of the time was smoke a lot of weed, do a lot of magic mushrooms, whatever else they could kind of get their hands on, and that kind of like pushed his psychosis worse and worse. And he ended up with some kind of drug-induced psychosis. He was approached by a whole bunch of different Christian groups. Some of them gave him a Bible, baptised him, told him he was filled with the Holy Spirit and had full access to God, and then left him alone in the bush. And he thought that was great, but kind of like a bit weird. And so he kind of like had these interactions with all these different groups, and a lot of them were actually Christian. And he had one interaction with an amazing group called the God Squad. And the God Squad's actually a bikie gang, a ministry group who are associated with bikie gangs. So their main thing is driving around and ministering to bikies. And he was kind of involved with a bikie gang at the time, just being kind of like a juvenile that needed income. So the God Squad kind of shared the gospel with him, taught him the gospel, and then got him involved in the church, hooked him in really well, and he actually was a part of this church for many years. He then, after kind of like picking himself up, once he understood the gospel, he gave up his addiction to drugs. He kind of turned his life around and started serving for Jesus. He didn't just say, I'm a Christian, he actually started being involved in the church. Then he made his way through their help into Melbourne, and so he had access to a couple of different, better medical organisations. So he was closer to St Vincent's, which looks after a lot of homeless people. And through that, he then got accommodation with Servants Community Housing, which is where I met him in 2013. And every week, I would actually meet up with this guy. I think I called him Bob at the start. I just really don't want to say his name. And we would have a Bible study, and it was just phenomenal to kind of like see the insights and depths that he actually had to the Bible. It was great. Now he has a cigarette every morning. Actually, I'm pretty sure he quit. I'm not sure, but it was like when I left, he was working on quitting. But he has about 15 cups of coffee a day, and he just sits on the same bench outside his accommodation, and he's the happiest guy in the world. So this accommodation is in Kew, and people would walk past. They walk past with their kids, they walk past with their dogs, and he pats every dog he sees, smiles with every kid, and he just brings joy to people on the street. He's amazing. People honk every day when they go past, and he's kind of like their little poster boy of happiness. It's really amazing. He has a key to a room which has a shower and a bed, and it locks. And for him, he also is surrounded by a community of people that he knows, that he sees regularly, that he talks to, that he considers friends, and some of them are really deep, like almost family relationships. So he's kind of belonging for the first time that he ever has. So that's Bob. The next guy, we'll call him Bazza, for the sake of it. So Bazza grew up in a really different home. He actually grew up in a pretty intelligent home. He did pretty well at school, eastern suburbs, middle class family, from Brisbane, not from Melbourne. He went to a great uni, and then when he was at uni, he got schizophrenia. It's unexplained how he got schizophrenia. He wasn't doing anything different to his other uni students. He was kind of just living the normal life, but his brain kind of just exploded a bit, and he ended up in the psych ward. So he kind of went in and out of the psych ward, and his parents were great, and they tried to look after him a bit, but then he became a little bit too much to handle at home because his psychosis was so vicious. So his psychosis, like what he hears is the voice of a policeman telling him to kill himself every single day. And that voice is as real for him as the chairs in this room are for us. And it's so hard to get your head around because I can't actually comprehend that he actually thinks there's someone behind him with authority telling him to kill himself. So he finds that just so hard to suppress. The other thing that they realised when he got this was that there's no drug out there which is the magical cure for schizophrenia. It just doesn't exist. So the way that it kind of works is that you go to a doctor, they say, yep, you've got schizophrenia, so we're going to put you on this medication for 6 months, and if it helps, then that'll be the one you're on. If it doesn't work, we'll change it over for another 6 months. So you've got 6 months of living with this hell in your head. So first one didn't work, second one didn't work, and he was just getting more and more annoying for his parents to live with, pretty much, and they just couldn't handle his kind of rage and outbursts. So they put him in a different kind of accommodation, and he's trialling all these different drugs, and then what he found was that if he drank, the voices were suppressed. So he got to the point where he would drink about a bottle of vodka a day, and that was the only thing that would suppress these voices. So no kind of administered medical drug was working. Alcohol was the thing that would suppress him. So he naturally became an alcoholic, completely dependent on it. And from there, because he was drinking, he was kind of constantly buzzed, not making good decisions, and then ends up, wrecking one home, getting kicked out, wrecking another home, getting kicked out, ending up homeless. Through the Salvation Army, he kind of got hooked in to crisis accommodation, and then once again contacted servants, and we housed him under the proviso of our guidelines. So that he kind of gets help and has control. He still drinks that much every day. He still doesn't have the perfect cure for his schizophrenia. So what is our Christian response to these two totally different men? One of them has really accepted the gospel and changed his ways, and the other one hasn't. So the kind of questions I want to unpack today is, how is a Christian supposed to respond to these two men, and how am I supposed to share the gospel with, let's call him Bazza? And what standards am I supposed to hold Paul? Sorry, Bob too. How am I supposed to say you should no longer smoke, or you should no longer? Do I have the same authority with my brothers and sisters in here that I do with people who are at that stage? So, a bit about my testimony. So I was born at a young age, like Bryn likes to say. I was born here in Melbourne. And when I was born, my parents were evangelical Christians, and they managed a boarding house for homeless people. When I was 3, we moved up to the Territory and worked with Indigenous people up there, because Mum and Dad have a real heart for vulnerable Australians. So I kind of adopted that heart as well. So when I was 18, I started working with Indigenous people for Royal Life Saving and Surf Life Saving. I just really liked it. And then I moved down here to help Mum with a boarding house that we actually grew up in. She'd come back down here to manage it. And that boarding house is run by a company called Servants. So what Servants is an organisation that came out in the 80s. If any of you are familiar with DHS, which is the Department of Human Services, they kind of are our go-to government organisation for housing vulnerable people. They had this huge mansion in Hawthorn, like I'm talking massive, probably one of the first houses built in Hawthorn, 4 stories, just gorgeous old Edwardian thing. And they said, we've got this house and we've got this huge rooms of 30 people on the back of it. Can your church, Hawthorn West Baptist Church, do anything with this house? And in a whim, the church just said, sure, we'll fill it full of homeless people and we'll just have a go at running it. And from there, it was like this roller coaster into how to house homeless people. So the kind of guidelines that they put in, that they were only going to house males for the only sake that it was just too dangerous, they thought, to house both male and female together when they didn't know what they were doing. They had to be over the age of 25. They had to be on disability pensions or New Start allowance. And that was kind of, their foundation. And their motto, which I think it says on the back, was respect, dignity and hope. That's part of the foundation that they wanted. So they wanted to give homeless people respect, dignity and hope. So when I moved down, they were just opening their second house. So we opened a house in Canterbury, and that house housed 25 homeless people. So I did this with another young group of uni students. So we all together lived in and we managed this house. And then we opened another house in Kew, and that's where then I moved there and helped open this other house, and that housed 28 people. I got married, and so I had to take a year off because you're not allowed to manage these houses in your first year of marriage, which is a really wise decision because you've got enough going on. But I think 1 year and 1 day we moved back into Kew, and Carly and I managed this house together. So when I say manage the house, our daily roles included putting out breakfasts, talking with people, pastorally caring for people, sorting out any arguments that went on, whether they're fights or he stole my cigarettes, or I can't pay rent this week. We collected rent, so every person in there paid rent, and we called the ambulance or the police probably once every 2 weeks on average. The kind of demographic of people who live there have been homeless at some stage in their life, but they're what we call low-level care. So you've got low-level care, medium-level care, high-level care. So low-level care, we don't hold any drugs, we don't administer any medication. You're meant to be able to live on your own. This is just a place for you to live on your own with a little bit of extra care. So with their rent, they get a room with a key, a shower, a bed, a little fridge, and they also get meals 7 days a week, because a church comes in and does a barbecue on the 7th day. They get breakfast provided, dinner provided, and then they buy their own lunch. So that's kind of a little bit what servants looks like, and that's my experience with vulnerable people. So I guess that's why I've been asked to share about it today. So I just want to start by saying I haven't studied it. I studied building at TAFE, and I'm studying theology. And the part of my job is sharing the gospel with people. So I guess that's why I want to talk about how do we actually share the gospel with homeless people. Two things I've got experience in, and how do you kind of link them as a wealthy Christian group. The last little bit I'll say about servants is that they now have 4 houses. They've just opened their 4th, and it's a brilliant house. It's in Hawthorne. It houses 10 women, and so it's an exclusively women house that we built with the help of the Liberal government, actually, when they got voted in. So the idea behind that one is it's for women who are at risk of domestic violence or have come out of that kind of situation. They're all single, none of them have kids that they can have in the house, but the manager that lives with them is actually a psychologist, a practicing clinical psychologist, and this is not like an extra job for her, this is just where she lives. So it's just this phenomenal setup for these women who are just given this extra... Sorry?
Is she Christian?
Yes, yeah, she is, yeah. So it's just this amazing opportunity. So everybody that works for servants is a Christian. That's part of our kind of doctrinal belief, if you want to work for them. But the whole thing's run off volunteers. I think they have 2 employees, the CEO, which is my mum, and the accountant, and then that's it. And so everybody who lives in the houses is completely volunteer. We also employ uni students and alike to cook. So the chefs that we have are actually paid really well on a casual basis. Cool. So with that, no way am I expert in homelessness. All the stats that I get are from the internet, from studies that we've done, like surveys, and from things like Headspace and the government. But yeah, I've had a bit of interaction with them. So a few things that I learned about homelessness while I was there. First of all, homelessness and mental health are so intertwined. They're like peas in a pod. It's very rare that you actually meet someone who's homeless who doesn't have at least depression. So 100% of our residents have mental health. I want to say problem, for want of a better term. Or condition is probably a better term. So they range from just mild depression all the way through to multiple personality, schizophrenia. Some really hard stuff to deal with. I'm not saying that all people who are homeless have a mental health problem at all, but I think it's really rare to find them that don't. So my second point would be when you mix mental health and homelessness, you get kind of what happened with BAZA, which is self-medication. Because if you're homeless, then you're probably not carrying an ID or a driver's license or a Medicare card, which means that you find it hard to actually go to hospital and have access to the kinds of things that we do. So if you're schizophrenic and you're homeless, how are you going to treat your schizophrenia? If you're depressed and you're homeless, how are you going to treat your depression? So you get a lot of self-medication, and that's usually through illicit drugs or alcohol. So the third thing, the services out there to help homeless people are absolutely fantastic and amazing, but there's no silver bullet. I think the problem with homelessness, especially in Victoria, is actually a wider, more systemic problem with our housing crisis. It has a lot to do with greed and kind of property stacking and people not wanting public housing close to their nice suburbs. So a problem that we had often would be trying to find a new residence, and we'd actually get complaints from the whole surrounding suburb saying we don't want these people living near us. So what happens is that you end up getting people sent out to distant suburbs where all your services are actually in the city. So, and if you send them out to these distant suburbs, and you just create ghettos. So these people are surrounded by other people in their situation, and it just kind of you make these absolute ghettos. And what we found is that when you house people next to people who are more affluent or more well-educated or well-off for any sense, they actually can rise to that standard, and that educated family doesn't lower. So we try to encourage people to kind of see that bigger picture. And because what happens when you create these ghettos, that people just end up going into the city and then being homeless in the city because they want to sleep next to the services. They want to, because they don't have money that they can just put on a Myki and travel back and forth. The fourth is the word home is a word that we use pretty lightly, pretty frequently. I think I know every one of you in this room. I know that you all go home and you lock the door. Like when I was writing this talk, I was just like, I've got the door locked right now. I've got a fridge full of food. I've got a shower. We've got a spare bedroom. Like our home, even just the differences between our home is stark, but some of these guys don't even understand the concept of home. So yeah, you can almost shut your eyes for a minute and just try picture if you didn't have a key. So if you didn't have a key to put your stuff. So if you get a card or if you get a disability pension, where do you keep that? So if you're walking around and you don't have a lockbox, or you don't have a home where you can just shut the door behind you and you're safe. So having a key a lot of the times is that dignity thing that serves. So like when these guys get a key and they say, does this lock work? Because so many rooming houses in Melbourne, they don't get a key, they get a room. And they honestly just sit in the corner and they watch that door and they wait for that door to open. The crime and the abuse, horrendous sexual abuse that goes on in boarding houses all through Melbourne, one of which was just closed down in St Kilda, had a pretty famous name, is just insane. So you have someone who sits there and they're homeless and it's raining and it's cold and it's freezing, and they go to something like St V's and they say, can I have crisis accommodation? Sure. They go to this crisis accommodation and they've got kind of like a evil stereotypical landlord who says, you know, it's so much for the night, they take that, your room's down there, and they have this disgusting mattress, and it's like worse than prison, because when prison, if a fight starts, the prison guards come. But in these places, it's not like that. So some of these guys just will not go. They will not go to these places. They'd much rather sleep in the cold and wet than try to face this, because I mean the chances of being raped or attacked or mugged and having everything taken from you again is just so high. So when you use that word home, or when you think of that word home, or when you shut the door tonight, that's like the main thing I want you to be thinking about, is like, some people can't do that. Just shut the world away. Fifth thing I learned is that mental health does not discriminate at all. I meet people from all kinds of backgrounds, guys that studied here, and then one day they just spiraled. You know, people from low socioeconomic backgrounds have a huge chance of getting mental health problems because of things like early introduction of drugs and alcohol, but also it just doesn't discriminate. Anybody can get depression, anybody can get schizophrenia. It just, when your card's up, it's up. Yeah, they would be my kind of 5 things I learned. So the Christian response, let's have a look at kind of what the Bible has to say. We've been doing the public Bible talks about wealth, so I'm not going to talk too much about wealth. Jump on YouTube, listen to the public Bible talks, because I think they've tied in really nicely with this. I'm kind of going to look at the Great Command and the Great Commission a bit. And to be honest, these things only make sense if you've got and understand the gospel. So, I mean, we were all once homeless and alienated and completely estranged from God. We were completely broken and living in our own little bubbles, and we thought that was good. And it's only because of Jesus coming in and shedding light into our lives that we now have a home with God. And there's a whole bunch of people in the world who are still homeless away from God. Like, that's the big problem. So if you don't have the gospel in your heart, like, that's the reason why we want to reach out and reach homeless people. We don't want to reach it because we're told to reach it. I don't want you to go home today and think, I'm going to reach homeless people because, you know, that's a good thing to do. I want you to reach homeless people because you were first reached. I think the Christian response and in any and all things comes from the Word of God. So the Bible has a huge amount to say about the treatment of homeless people and vulnerable people. So great command, great commission. Two fantastic moments in the Bible. The great command, where Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he replies, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul and mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. And the next was the Great Commission. Before Jesus ascends to the right hand of God at the end of Matthew, he commissions his disciples to go to all the nations, making disciples wherever they go, paraphrasing big time. And I'm of the firm belief that out of these two statements, they're kind of at the core of the Christian life, right? I think every Christian needs to have love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul and mind, and love their neighbour as themselves. And all Christians should be pursuing to make disciples of all nations. We don't get out of this because we're not doing one or the other in our vocation. And it's through God's love and through the love of the gospel that we're actually able to do this again. We're not doing this because we're just commanded to, and it's good to obey commands. We're doing this because we are first loved. So I can't reiterate, that's the foundation of why. So the Christian response is just not how to do good things, it's how to do good things in these tougher situations through the power of the gospel. So with that said, there are many different options. There's kind of two extreme options that you get when you're responding to homelessness. There's the physical help or the spiritual help. So one group of people will focus largely on accommodation and food for the homeless, and the other group of people might hand out Bibles and Scripture and the Word of God. Now these are both two great things. If you want to get involved in either of them, there's no shortage of organisations that do that. But which one of these do you think is better or right? Good, I like it. They're both great, I think. One's showing practical love to people who are in a less vulnerable state, and the other one's showing spiritual love to people, trying to solve their ultimate problem, which is eternity away from God. Both are super important. And in short, I think the Christian response is to do them both at the same time. So, briefly, I think the reason why I'm sharing about homelessness and God's Christian response to it isn't because I don't think it's Melbourne's biggest problem. I think Melbourne's biggest problem is it's separated from God. Okay? So Melbourne's biggest problem isn't a growing number of homeless people. It's not global warming. It's the fact that we're separated from God. So we want to be tackling that at the same time as tackling this massive systemic problem, which is Melbourne's homelessness. We don't want to be kind of putting a band-aid solution on the biggest problem of the world. So there's no point in housing someone for a short term if you're not going to save them for the long term. So what can we do practically? What practical things can Christians, how can they practically respond to homelessness? Getting involved would be my first suggestion. Soup kitchens are great, I have to say. They're a really good way to just meet homeless people, talk to homeless people, and just get involved. But ultimately, what is great, I think, is seeing these guys and girls housed. That obviously is my passion. And because once they're housed, I think it's so easy to get them into great churches. I think Christian-run boarding houses are a great place to start because they usually have switched-on Bible-believing staff. You can run Bible studies, which are just, as I said, incredible. When I ran this Bible study in my boarding house, we had 3 guys come to Christ. The insights that other guys would produce was just amazing because they've actually engaged with Christian services their whole homeless life. Because Christians are usually on the forefront of helping the people on the street. So they're actually really scripturally based. And sometimes they can be a bit like Sunday school where they know the right answer is Jesus. Because that's kind of like, would you like a bowl of soup? And then someone talks about Jesus and they kind of clue on. They're pretty smart. And so it's actually about pushing them further and actually trying to get the gospel deeper into their heart. when a rougher person starts to attend your church, I think you have two major responsibilities practically. First one is to minister to them. They are unique and different. But the second one is don't treat them like an alien. So a church member is a church member. If these people have become Christians, they need to be serving alongside other Christians. They need to be held to that same account. They need to be put on the welcoming team. They need to be put on the worship team if they can. And this is a hard thing. This is a confronting thing. They need to be put in a small group. So you need to invite them into your house, involve them in your Bible studies, because if they just come to church and they're treated exactly like they are with every other service, then I don't think that's showing true, honest, good Christian love. And this is hard because they stink. Like, homeless people really smell. So, when you're having dinner, you just got to kind of bottle and get over it. Like, it's a really important thing for these people to actually feel human. They're just as saved as you are, if they know Christ, and they're just as saved as the pastor is. So as much as you want to run up and debrief about the sermon or turn to your mates that you see every week, it's a simple conversation or inviting them out to lunch is usually just goes such a long way. A tricky part, I think, of the larger question is how do we actually go about proclaiming the gospel in a sensitive way to vulnerable people in our care? They're a captive audience if you are involved in an organisation of any sort. So is it right? I think the thing is you have to decide, is it right to take advantage of this captive audience? For me, personally, it comes down to conscience and moment. When you're serving people, I think you've kind of got the two schools. You've got I can give a cup of soup to someone and the cup of soup has a Bible verse on it, and here you go, Sarah, here's your cup of soup with your Bible verse. I hope you have a great night. That is a form of evangelism. You have to decide, is that an effective form of evangelism? Often, I don't think so. So people can be saved like that. Absolutely. No one tells the Spirit where to go. People can be saved like that. But I actually think a more effective form of evangelism that I've seen in my life is actually saying, Sarah, let's go get a coffee together. Let me actually learn about your life. Let me help you build that trust and then share the gospel. Because that, like we do any other evangelism, one is almost a form of street preaching, which has its place, and the other is a form of true discipleship, which we're a lot more comfortable with, I guess, more sane people. So I want us to take off our shields and kind of get vulnerable with vulnerable people, because that's a great way to make disciples. So I want you to think about how much you're copying out of your evangelism when you start to... Because it's one thing to get involved, and it's another thing. Like, making disciples, you're sharing a really offensive gospel. Okay? Some people will hate it and reject it. Some people will love it and have their lives changed. So if you're giving it to them on a cup, you have no idea what way they're taking it. But if you're serving them, seeking to help them, then sharing the gospel with them, you're going to face that rejection, or you're going to face that salvation. And being knocked back when you're trying to share the gospel is part of the Christian walk. It will happen. But as I said, no one tells the Spirit where to go. So even if you do one-on-one discipleship, making kind of evangelism with homeless people, does not mean you're guaranteed to make disciples. Cool. So the last way that I think this room can respond is an obvious way that we've been talking about through our public Bible series is with money. But this will come for you guys more later in life. It's not about how much you can donate to shelters or things like that, although they're really good things. It's actually not property stacking. So property stacking is a massive problem with homelessness at the moment. So I'll hand out these slides. These are kind of just some stats on homelessness, and you'll see the number one thing there is that the housing crisis in Victoria, I think I only printed out 9, so it might have to be one between a couple, is actually property. So property is one of our biggest downfalls. So when your earning capacity gets large and when you have the opportunity to perhaps buy more than one property, hesitate, think about the need and think about kind of what that's going to do to the wider community. Because a lot of these great houses where we would love to be planting more and more of these boarding houses, old nursing homes are just empty because someone's got the land and they're just sitting on that nest egg, and that's their kind of retirement fund, which is fair enough. But also, we would love to turn that into a community house. So that's all I've really got to say. And I was just going to open it up to questions and comments. The last thing I'd say is I've got this bunch of books here, and they're two great books, anthology and narrative. And so these were written by students at private schools, so Scotch and Xavier and MLC. And what they did, it was a partnership with us, and this one's full of poems and art pieces from our residents, and this is full of stories from our residents. And reflections of, so we're trying to bridge the gap between the ultra rich and ultra poor. They're free, they're coffee table books. If you wrap them up and give them as Christmas presents, they're awesome. I've bought like 20, so take 2 each. And yeah, they're just a really cool project if you want to read a bit more about, my friends' lives, I guess. I'm happy to call them that. Absolutely. Any questions? Yo.
How many people go into poverty because of like debt and like facing those issues rather than kind of the mental health issues?
Yep, big time.
And then like obviously that's going to affect with where the money goes for them as well.
Yeah, whether it goes.
Yeah.
So a lot of them are in critical debt. So a lot of the time, part of like they're moving in, I'd sit down and say, "What's your story?" And I'd walk away just like I don't know where to start. Like, you know, if I get into debt, I might be behind like $5,000 when I was an apprentice. But when these guys get into debt, they've gambled like $300,000, $400,000 away, and they're in debt to dangerous people. And you kind of like, shall we start a budget? You know, and you like start a budget and you're like, right, you should pay this off in like 400 years because housing's so expensive. It's super hard. A lot of people go into debt because of it. Especially those who are paying. So some guys that we have come out of prison. So Servants has just started to link up with, is it Prison Fellowship or Prison Ministries? And they're a Presbyterian mob that do great work in churches, in prisons. And so we're trying to bridge the gap between people coming out of prison and going straight, becoming homeless straight away. Because they come out with huge debts and nowhere to go. And so they end up going to these random housing shelters, which are just another form of prison. And they commit a crime to get something and they go straight back in. So how do we handle the debt problem? I've got no idea, honestly. But cheap accommodation is huge for them because that's where their money needs to go.
What about jobs? What kind of income are they getting? What kind of that?
So disability pensions and New Start allowance are really good. I mean, I think for a fortnight they were paying about $450 to live with us, but that's all the meals, accommodation, gas, internet, everything. Some of them were lollipop men. So story in here about Paul. He's a lollipop man. Really lovely guy. Just an absolute superstar. Actually goes down. So a lot when you're walking around, you'll see a lot of lollipop people are from low socioeconomic backgrounds or just down and out. Other guys are labourers or gardeners. But some of them just stay at home and smoke, and because they can't hold a job. They have either zero education or zero will. So we have a couple of programs that we're trying to implement, which actually they were again meant for ex-cons. So prisoners who would go with a gardener and he would just say, "We're clearing all these blackberries, and we're just going to share the gospel with these guys while we clear the blackberries." So some of our residents were helping with that, but I mean, the main reason why they're in the position they are is because they don't have work. And you don't want to make a whole bunch of excuses for them, but they have some really good ones. But in saying that, how do you think we could employ these people? So I have one friend, Rachel. She used to sing at our church. She has the mental capacity of probably an 8-year-old. She's such a legend. But her job, she was working in the packaging industry, and which employs a lot of, I don't know the term, uneducated, for want of a better term, people. But that industry is like just on the ropes because it's all becoming automated. So when we think about automation coming in, it's fantastic. You know, everything's getting cheaper and faster and quicker to make. But the first jobs that go are their jobs. So if your family has worked for generations driving forklifts, like Serge, another friend of mine from here, his dad was a forklift driver all the way back. That's the highest degree in their family. And now it's all done automated. So you got to, like, when we think about technology progression, it's a wonderful thing. But honestly, where you vote is probably going to have one of the biggest impacts. So not only looking at fast progression, but also how does that help? Like car manufacturing is another big one in Geelong that took a lot of these guys' jobs. So yeah, like when you think about your practical response, what a government is doing in terms of, you have to make up your mind, obviously, like what is going to be the best help, but how you vote really has a massive impact on these people.
What are some programs?
What are programs? Well, for example, Liberal government, when they got in, they promised to give servants $300,000 to open a women's house, so I voted for them. But it was also, a lot of the stuff, like Mum's banging on at the moment about the tightening down on people who have more than one property that's empty. I don't know.
Have empty houses.
Oh yeah, heaps. So there's thousands of apartments in Melbourne are completely empty because they're just getting capital gain.
Why don't they rent it out?
Because if they rent it out, then they get taxed at a larger bracket because it's an income. So it's actually cheaper for them to have an empty house. So, I mean, which seems crazy to us. That's like mega rich people. But sometimes not. Sometimes it's just like a couple who invested really wisely and that's their kind of nest egg. But there's when bigger developers, probably like Melbourne Uni, would have some bigger sites that are empty waiting to be developed in the future. But I mean, this is going to, you have to decide, is Melbourne Uni going to use it for good and bad and that kind of thing. So I actually don't, I'm not going to stand here for a second and tell you who I think you should vote for. You need to make up that decision. But I guess get woke would be like my biggest advice. Yeah. It's really depressing, isn't it? Like every time I think about it and really, but also meeting these guys has been one of the highlights of my life, and I love reading through. Carlos, for example, is a great mate that I went to church with for many years, and he overdosed a couple of years ago. Broke my heart. He lived with us for 20 years, and that was a picture of him at his wedding at Hawthorn West. But then that marriage broke down. Christian couple from our church. His mum was a diplomat, first female diplomat to Uruguay, and so travelled around the world. Very wealthy guy, but heroin got the better of him, and he lost his life to it. He struggled with the heroin addiction very publicly in our church for a long time, and he would have these huge ups and downs, but our love for him never changed, and his love for Jesus never changed either. He just had an incredible vice. So you can imagine being addicted to porn, times by a billion, have it ruin your life. That's heroin. And so in terms of vices, it's pretty similar. Just get to know these people. They're just amazing. Yeah, I could talk about them all.
It's 2 o'clock now.
Let's wrap.
So, thank you all for coming. Let's give a pat. think you've said lots of ways for how we should get involved. So I think stay around if you want to chat more with Pat. If we've got more questions, remember to grab a book. If you want to have something to invite people over, they can look at the coffee table, read the book. So we'll see you next week. Next week is the history of the Bible. So that's a really, really important one for all evangelicals. So invite all your evangelical friends. So they, understand their evangelical